Okay, hello. Today is the 3rd of April, 2023, and we pay homage to Aldo Rossi, who was born on April 3rd, 1931. He died in 1997 in a car accident, and thus we lost an architect who meant a lot for the end of the 20th century. But just a second, I need to. Okay, so Aldo Rossi, as you can see, born on May 3rd in 1931, was an Italian architect. What is going on here? Was an Italian architect and designer who achieved international recognition in 4 distinct areas: architectural theory, drawing and design, and also product design. He was one of the leading proponents of the postmodern movement. He was the first Italian architect to receive the Pritzker Prize. But, you know, this is a short description from Wikipedia. There are more complex things to be said about Aldo Rossi. Here he was. Well, perhaps we can talk a little bit about postmodernism. What does it mean, a postmodern architect? Because in his case, his relationship with history was not as simplistic and as troubling as that of some other architects. I mean, he was an original architect. He didn't copy, historical columns or architectural motifs from the past, but he did know, what we call the past. But he was essentially, although critics think that he was problematizing modernism, because he was he seemed to be against the freedoms that modernity brought with it, and he advocated a limited number of architectural typologies and built accordingly. But as you can see his wristwatch, which he designed, and even the expression of his face. This was not a man dogmatically finding refuge in a few traditional typologies. He was highly creative. Here he is with his wife and someone from the Pritzker family, I guess, on the right. He received the Pritzker Prize in 1990. Again, the first Italian to receive it. Then others followed, like Renzo Piano. Some drawings, and he drew incessantly, and his drawings are artistic works. I mean, very potent artistically, very pleasing to look at, and very enticing and provocative. He also painted, and his sketches, his renderings, if we are to call them so, are unusual in the sense that he creates these complex images where he combines various buildings he was working on the same page, so to speak. Here he goes even further. He includes a silhouette of a housing project that he built actually in Milan with, objects to be found on almost any table in the kitchen or whatever. And you see that the domestic objects are even bigger than the houses. So you would say this is, unacceptable, because it's not how in reality things are. But what is real in art and architecture, at least sometimes, is an art. Now here, there might be some echoes of a great Italian painter, Giorgio Morandi. The sketch, there are many books published with the drone works of Aldo Rossi. He explored continuously, and he, as you can see here, this was a project that he won for a cemetery in Modena, and we are going to see it. And I had the chance to actually visit it. I would love students to be as explorative as he was, and to draw beyond the confines of prescribed way of uneven dimensions. No. At least in a university, you should have the freedom to choose your way of presenting your ideas. Doesn't matter how crazy that manner. In fact, I would say the crazier, the better. This is what a major Italian architect did. And, there are countless books published with the drone architectures. He didn't just draw, he also built. But for a good number of years, he was considered a theoretician. He was a professor. He had he was involved in education at the Polytechnic Institute in Milan, and then at the University of Architecture in Venice. The only architecture university in Italy is in Venice, and where the gateway, the entrance gate was designed brilliantly by his equally brilliant colleague and perhaps even friend, Carlo Scarpa. Yes, architects like them make you dream. Architects like them make you enjoy the great chance to work within the field of architecture. Now, again, I look at this drawing and, I see all this redness, which red is the color of life and of love. But this is a project for a cemetery. And the buildings, you are going to see, the built buildings are not like this, are not in these colors. But again, architecture and even architectural rendering could be abstract and could be, it could have plastic qualities that are not illustrative in a strict sense. You try to evoke an atmosphere and a feeling you try to express through your building. And you look at this sketch, it's not objectively correct, but that's not the point. He was searching for the spirit of the building through form, yes, but not in a literal correct depiction of what he intended to represent. He was an artist who wrote a scientific autobiography. And look here, also melancholia, no? Because we see fragments of his buildings with cracks, the passage of time. And in itself, the drawing is artistic, is poetical. It has artistic qualities. It's not just a means towards an end, which is the building itself. Is in itself some kind of an end. This could be problematic sometimes when you make a drawing which finds satisfaction in itself and neglects the goal, which is to make a building. But he knew how to make buildings, and he built a large number of buildings. Again, a drawing by Aldo Rossi. Like in a dream. These are drawings done for Berlin, when in the 1980s he was invited, and I did show some of his works yesterday when I talked about the architecture of Berlin. He enjoyed drawing, obviously. He loved to draw. He loved to, why is that horse on this collage? Why not? Maybe he loves, I'm sure he loved horses. Horses inspired him. He was a poet, in other words. That is, he was conforming to what Frank Lloyd Wright said. A great architect is a great poet. I don't know if he wrote poetry or not. He published some books and he wrote, but I don't know. I never read a poem per se with words by Aldo Rossi. But he was a poet through his visual works, through his plastic works, through drawing, through the buildings he built. In that sense, he was a poet. What you see here, there are several buildings that he built. In a certain way, I think he was questing for himself. He was searching for himself through the medium of architecture. Maybe I said something banal. I also think he was not indifferent to the phenomenon that perplexes all of us, and that is death. Because we see there, you know, it's some kind of an animal, almost a skeleton of an animal, and that this is also reflected in some kind of an architecture. And I think any sensitive person cannot neglect the two sides, the two cups of the existential hourglass: life and death, life and death. Life becomes death, death becomes life through memory. Look here, you know, it's a nature morte. It's a, you know, a typical theme in visual arts, where on a table you have a vase with flowers or some objects. Well, instead of flowers, he has a Coca-Cola and a pack of cigarettes and some of his buildings. Why not? At least he created a drawing which I would love to have on the wall in my own room. And by the way of this, I want to tell you that many years ago, I was invited to a gathering, a kind of a party in the studio of Stephen Hall in New York. And I had to go to the toilet, and I had to say that I was a little bit surprised, and not necessarily in a good sense, that right in front of the, you know, toilet per se object, there was a little drawing by Aldo Rossi. So if you sat on the toilet, you looked at the drawing by Aldo Rossi. I found it a little bit perverse. Sorry, Stephen, but I don't know. Maybe I'm just a banal man who has bourgeois, you know, expectations, but I think that drawing by Aldo Rossi could have been somewhere else. Stephen Hall had enough space in his studio. Anyway, but one thing was for sure: Stephen Hall loved the drawing and, you know, collected it by Aldo Rossi. Yes, a little drawing. This is part of, I don't know if he presented this particular drawing in the competition for the cemetery in Modena. There are different alternatives of this project presented differently, but I like this one very much, and it's not the only one that I like. Like here we see, but anyway, we are going to see the buildings later on. Now he built this little cabin on the beach. He built it, but you see, he was dreaming. It was like in a dream, you know. It was obsessing him, this little cabin, and he created this drawing, like a multitude of cabins. building some projects. Now we open the door to his built work. Initially, like in the 1960s, so he was born in 1931, I think, or 1933. Anyway, he was still in his 20s when he built this villa with Leonardo Ferrari. And this is a surprise. It was a surprise for me when I discovered these early works by Aldo Rossi, because they were not announcing what was to follow. Is this one? I mean, this is, with the exception of the bicycle, you know, which is not, it's a, you know, it's a very nice bicycle, but it's rather, you know, classical, or, you know, it's not a modern bicycle. The building is a modern building. And I think it's a very fine building in the tradition of, you know, Orthodox modernity. An early work, and the influence of Adolf Loos was easy to notice. But it's a building that no one would be ashamed of. It's a fine building, and he was in his 20s. Aldo Rossi, together with that other architect. Now, Bruno Zebi, the important theoretician of modernism, Italian himself, he thought that symmetry is totally unacceptable in a modern architecture. But actually, Aldo Rossi, and in this sense, you could say he was not per se modern, although I think he was a modern architect, but he employs symmetry all the time, not in this early work, though. Now, the competition for the monument to the resistance in Cuneo, 1962, very abstract. Now we are getting closer to what Aldo Rossi was to become. Even graphically, it's a cryptical, you know, presentation, but I think it's refined. It shows a level of graphic maturity. I don't know exactly what is happening there. I didn't study the project, but I have the feeling that I mean, it's not so difficult to decipher, actually, even if you didn't read about it. The cube does appear in his work, and even this, please remember, try to remember this image, because we are going to see a fountain that he built in Milan, which is which reminds one of this early project. Monumento alla Resistenza a Cuneo. Now, this bridge for the triennial in Milan from 1964, you know, cross-section triangle, you know, some might say is a formalist gesture. Well, you cannot easily remove form from architecture. It's impossible, actually. Monumental fountain in Segrate, 1965. We are getting closer and closer to the paradigmatic Aldo Rossi. His architecture became some kind of maybe I could call it ur-architecture. That is a primordial architecture, and almost yeah, but what is somehow strange in a way, that the fundamentalist architecture that sometimes he was able to externalize has touches of I mean, there is something reminding one of the drawings done by a child when a child depicts a house, for example. It's this mixture between the austerity of almost a fundamentalist architecture and the innocence of an infantile perception of the world that a child has. I don't know if I described well. You know, even here, you know, it's this playfulness. It's a cylinder, and then there is a prismatic building in the back, and then this, you know, triangular tube that ejects water. It uses primary forms, but there is also a certain level of playfulness, and we are going to see this aspect in his works almost constantly. An interesting mixture between what is called neo-rationalism, because he was considered a neo-rationalist architect. You know, the rationalist movement in architecture existed historically. That's why he was called a neo-rationalist. But this rationalism or neo-rationalism was combined, was intertwined with with some kind of you know, infantile. Maybe the word infantile is not quite correct because it could have negative connotations, but I'm referring to the you know, the playfulness of childhood when operating with forms. A competition for this district in Monza, 1966. We see the grid. He also uses the grid like a neo-rationalist or rationalist. He was not afraid of, as I said, of symmetry, of the 90 degrees angle, of squares and cubes and so on. What is this? This is a very important work that he built, a large block of flats. I read today, in fact, for more than 2,000 people. There are two actually, one built by Carlo Aimonino, another important Italian architect, and one by Aldo Rossi from 1967 to 1974. Monte Amiata complex, Galaratese quarter in Milan. And here you see the, well, the resolution perhaps is not great. The picture could have been larger, but I hope I have one. I don't, but we can see from above the buildings. Here we see Aldo Rossi, and here we see Carlo Aimonino, and it's still a very valid housing complex, quite large. As I said, just the contribution of Aldo Rossi was for more than 2,000 people. This is the building by Aldo Rossi in Milan. The building by Carlo Aimonino appears to be freer, but you know, in a last analysis, maybe the work by Rossi was a little bit more original, although I don't mind at all, you know, the contribution by Carlo Aimonino, which is here. So here is Carlo Aimonino, and here is Aldo Rossi. He very often uses this window, square window, you know, divided in 4 smaller squares. He loves the square. As I said, he thought that in the history of architecture, you know, there was a limited number of types, you know, building types or typologies, and he didn't feel there is a need to continuously invent new forms and so on. But he found great freedom within this conception about the art of building. A design for a town hall in Scandigi, 1968. I like this page, but I never attempted to read what's going on there. It's probably in Italian, and anyway. But we see already an architecture that is flirting heavily with symmetry. There are some small deviations, but later on we are going to see, you know, projects that are perfectly symmetrical. This cemetery, we saw some rendering, some drawings in colors for this cemetery, which I visited from 1971 to 1984, and it is an important work by I almost said Carlos Scarpa, because I was thinking of the Brion Cemetery by Scarpa. No, I'm talking about Aldo Rossi. Here it is. Now, what to make of this? You know, this is not a conventional cemetery. This is a provocative cemetery. It's so different from the Brion Cemetery by Scarpa that I mentioned, or the Igualada Cemetery by Eric Miralles and Carmen Pinos. But it's through and through Aldo Rossi project and building. You could say it's too strict, it's too cubical, it's too rigid, it's too austere. Well, the austerity is problematized by the colors. You see the color, there are colors which are not the colors of death. You could also say that, hey, wait, what I see here is almost the Galaratese project for Milan, except that this is the city of death, or the city of the dead, is a cemetery. But, you know, between life and death, the frontier is actually thin. So much so that Heraclitus, to my amazement, apparently thought that what we call life is actually death, and what we call death is actually life. Well, I don't know what to make of this, of what Heraclitus said, but one thing is for sure. Many people, if not most of them, talk about the beyond, the life after death, as you know, the other life, into the afterlife. But it's also life, a different kind of life. So maybe you know, in the duality of things, life and death, as I mentioned earlier, are like the two cups of an hourglass, and they nourish each other depending on how you turn the you know, the hourglass. I remember once I did a project for a competition in Japan with just this very name, the Hourglass House. Now I'm a little bit nostalgic. The interior of that big cube that you saw is this one. It's good architecture. It's strict, it's regular, it's rhythmical. It's there are, you know, there is an equidistance here between the structural elements. Everything is controlled, but the overall feeling, I think, is close to surrealism. I mean, it's let's call it neo-rationalist architecture, but it has something mysterious, or something, you know, in the absence of a different word, poetical, lyrical. Although, you know, strictly speaking, he operates with squares, and just the diagonals of the stairs are the only accidents. Otherwise, okay, there are some rotations here, but all in all, it's an architectural language that is reduced to an essence. It's a good work by Aldo Rossi. Here we see various depictions of the project, because he continued to draw even after, perhaps even after the building was built. It obsessed him, you know, because perhaps Le Corbusier was right. Architecture is not a profession, architecture is a state of mind. And if you have a project in your mind, you become attached to it, and it inhabits your spirit. And it doesn't matter almost that the building was built. You continue to have a dialogue with that project, with what preoccupied you, and you continue to make drawings. If I remember correctly, even Le Corbusier, apparently some of his preliminary sketches for some of his buildings were actually done after the buildings were built. I didn't believe it when I read it, but that's what I remember reading. Yeah, this drawing is an artwork in itself, and it's probably, who knows in what museum. Because architecture is not just about the literal depiction of the measurable. It's also about the beyond of the imagination of the creator. I mean, we didn't see in the reality of the built work, there is no yellow like it is here. There is no pink like it is here. And I'm talking about the horizontal surfaces. He created an artwork of a project that when built was in a certain way different from the graphic representation. But in spirit, it was not different. And this is important. It's not even, you look at it and it's not actually a sad cemetery. I mean, maybe because I say this because I look at the grass, which is green and which is a sign of life. No, but I also look at the blue roof. That blue roof is not, a dark, representation of the terrible undertones of what death means. The Modena Cemetery, Aldo Rossi. Now the design for City Hall in Mugio, 1972. I like these drawings by Aldo Rossi. They are playful, but they are studies, they are sketches, but the conception of the building is already here. And they are artworks in themselves. Now, a primary school, we just talked before the presentation about schools. This is a primary school in Fagnano, Olona, 1972, perfectly symmetrical. You would say unbearably so. How could he do something like this? This is a Nazi school. This is a fascist school. This is a Stalinist school. But it's not. I mean, this is a paradox in the architecture of Aldo Rossi. He seems to be very strict, rigid, but somehow, the finality of the work is closer to the spirit of childhood. I mean, you look here, it would have infuriated probably Bruno Zevi. But yes, it is symmetrical. Yes, it is rigid. But somehow, because he operates with primordial forms, and there is something of childhood, I think, in his architecture that saves it from being morose, depressingly totalitarian architecture. Although when I look at these children, the way they are aligned, I mean, this was not because of Aldo Rossi. It was, is this rather strange picture. The children didn't have to be like this, I don't know what mad professor put the children to be like this. It actually breaks my heart to see them like this. Um, I like to think that even Aldo Rossi would have protested, would have told the children, please move, jump, break the, break this compact, maddening alignment of yourselves. 1972, 1976. Like this. This is how the children are supposed to be, free to move in their own ways and not to be, like pawns on a chess table, aligned so no one would identify himself or herself properly. Aldo Rossi. Single family homes in Moscow, 1977. Again, some architects would fall into an infantile architecture, employing such architectural elements as he does, as he did. But he doesn't, he stops just at the right time. And yet there is a reference to that pre-architecture that children cannot avoid, so to speak, when they draw. Ask a child to draw a house, and they almost all of them draw it the same way, with like a square and with a sloping roof, which is a triangle, and symmetrical most of the time. Teatrino Scientifico, 1978. He was preoccupied by theater, and he built a beautiful Teatro del Mundo in Venice, a floating one, and we are going to see it. But the world of the theater is very close to the world of architecture. And I think, theater and architecture, architecture and theater, this is a pair that always was present in the history of architecture. And I think architects should love theater, and theater, theater should love architecture. And by the way of theater, please do not forget Sibiu in Transylvania, in Romania, has one of the greatest international theater festivals in the world. Some even think it has the greatest. Now I'm a little bit patriotic because I was born there, but it's true. It is an amazing international theater festival, and it takes place in June, but it's already late to buy tickets because people from other countries come to see this festival, which takes place even on the streets of the city, even at night in a lake, when the actors throw themselves in the lake and the spectators together with the actors, or in the tram car, and in very unusual circumstances. It's a very unconventional theater festival, explosive, exuberant. It's a phenomenon. Yes. The floating 250-seat Teatro del Mondo, which I mentioned, Teatro del Mondo in Venice, and Triumphal Arch, both built for the Venice Biennial, but Teatro del Mondo from 1979, apparently there was a tradition in Venice to have, floating theaters built in wood. It's a very appealing, very poetical. It's this here. We are going to see the building. I don't know what happened to it. I hope they didn't destroy it. When I went to Venice a few times, I didn't see it. So apparently it's not floating any longer on the canals of Venice, but I hope they keep it somewhere. Here it is, but I will have other looks at it. Here is, you know, the building by Longhena, the great church, and here is the Teatro del Mondo of Aldo Rossi on water. You know, you say this is the most simplistic architecture and infantile architecture that you can imagine. Yes, but it transcends infantilism and becomes, you know, nostalgically serious, and you know, it's almost, it is timeless in its simplicity. Teatro del Mondo, 1979, Aldo Rossi. And we see here the octagon. Let's not forget, the octagon has a great tradition in architecture, and Leonardo da Vinci was obsessed by the octagon. Almost all architecture that Leonardo da Vinci sketched, because he didn't build, but sketched, was based on the octagon. And here it is, Teatro del Mondo, with Longhena in the back, and some of the houses, the apartment buildings in Venice, and the canal, and you know, the machinery that you know, makes the floating of the theater possible. Very nice. It's hard not to be nostalgic. And in this building here, Tadao Ando created you know, a new architecture inside the building. From here, you can see across the canal two churches, important churches by Andrea Palladio, Longhena. Here inside Tadao Ando in the foreground, Aldo Rossi. Nice. And you know, we see the massive, almost flamboyant architecture, Baroque architecture of Longhena. And in front, we see this, you know, almost schematic, sketched symbol of ephemerality. It's an ephemeral architecture done in wood, floating, vulnerable. So we have almost like a symbol of vulnerability, and in the back, the you know, the triumphant symbol of the religious, you know, continuity and persistence. And yes, this is the building where Tadao Ando. Unfortunately, the entrance is expensive. I was there, but I didn't enter. Anyway, another nice picture with the Teatro del Mondo by Aldo Rossi, and this one is even better. No one can you know, say that this is not a very, you know, poetical photograph. I think it is. It is very nice, because after all, what is life? What is life? It's a Teatro del Mondo. We are born in order to die and to disappear, to vanish in the fog of time. Now, apartments in, this was for that exhibition in Berlin from 1980s. They designed two Berlin blocks, and I showed them yesterday when I talked about the architecture of Berlin. We look at them again. So, as I mentioned, Berlin had the initiative 3 times in the 20th century to invite some of the most important architects to build apartment buildings and even some houses in 1930s, in 1950s, and in 1980s. And this was in 1980s, and Aldo Rossi had the chance to build a lot. Here we see some, you know, some of his studies and the renderings for the housing complex. This is one of the buildings, but it's not just a building. He built the whole block from here to here. It's all Aldo Rossi. So apparently the Germans valued very much Aldo Rossi and, commissioned him accordingly. This is the other one, the other block, if we are to call it so, designed by Aldo Rossi. So you see, he uses regularity and geometry, sometimes, most of the time strict. He uses symmetry, but he also, you see, creates asymmetrical configurations, also chromatically. There is green, there is red. I mean, these are the colors of use. Here, yes, he uses it's more uniform, this continuous facade towards the street. But you see, all the windows are the same. Square divided with a cross in 4 smaller squares. Berlin, Aldo Rossi. This building is not by him. I don't know who designed it, but he designed all this. And there are some variations. It's not it's not an oppressively continuous giant block with identical apartments. And the colors, again, bring some joy to the eye. And as you can see, he uses colors very courageously, I would say. The octagonal courtyard, and I hope I have a plan here of that of this large housing complex. Now look at this triumphant redness, and it is triumphant. I don't know why students in architecture, in some schools of architecture, do not employ such a triumphant red. Now, Tori Shopping Center in Parma, 1979. Well, from afar, you wouldn't say it's a shopping center, would you? Inside is a different story, especially with people inside. It does begin to look like a shopping mall. We shop, therefore we are. I shop, therefore I am. Shopping, the terminal of all human activity, as Rem Koolhaas calls it. A middle school in Brony, 1979. A study or some kind of a presentation drawing, perfectly symmetrical, you could almost say oppressively so, but it's still an interesting architecture. The octagon again, the theater. You see the plan. What could be more, primeval almost, or how to call it? That's why I said Urarchitektur. I don't know if you know, but Goethe, the great German poet, he was searching in the Black Forest for the Urplant, the primordial plant that he thought all the other plants were born from. And he saw that the Ur plant had a built-in duality, like in electricity, plus and minus, ion and cation. And from that Ur plant, all the other plants were born. And he was actually searching in the Black Forest, I read, for that Ur plant. He was hoping to discover it. Well, a poet is a dreamer, essentially, even when with scientific concerns. Now you look at this school by Aldo Rossi and you say, what's going on here? it's so strict, it's so rigid. But in some curious way, he is able to marry this rigidity, this symmetry, with something having to do with childhood, I would say. It's not. It's this is the charm in a way of the architecture of Aldo Rossi. Well, okay, maybe in this picture, which is not colored, and the building is actually not colored, unlike the apartment buildings in Berlin, this could make some people a little bit uncomfortable. But the octagon has such a history of symbolism that saves the show in a way. Monumental Tower in Melbourne, Australia. The red one there in the background. But you see that when he draws a building that he works on, he introduces other buildings that he either built or preoccupied him or made projects for. Like, for example, what does the Teatro del Mondo doing in a drawing with the Melbourne Tower? This was supposed to be, the tower was not built. Now, head office of this in Perugia, 1982. It does look like a head office, too much so, I would say. Imposingly so. Not all his architecture, in my opinion, is sufficiently inspirational. It could be, I don't know. I should contemplate more his work in order to say something that is not just filling the space with words. A house in Pocono Pines in the United States. He taught at Cornell University and Yale University for a good number of years. So he was familiar with the United States. And in 1982, he built this house, which is not alarmingly, new or innovative. If you didn't know it was built by Aldo Rossi, you could have said, sure, maybe some local contractor built it. Because this is the paradox. Here you had a very personal, almost idiosyncratically so architect who actually attempted to almost arrive at an architecture of anonymity. I think very easily one could compare or talk simultaneously about Heinrich Tessenov in Germany and Aldo Rossi in Italy. What is this? That cabin, we saw sketches of this cabin, which he built, the paradigmatic little cabin for the beach. Now, what is this? Casa Aurora, home of Financial Textile Group in Turin, 1984-1987. Turin has a great Baroque architecture, had great Baroque architects, but this is not a Baroque architecture. This is Aldo Rossi, the neo-rationalist. Also, let us not forget, he was very active at that time when postmodernism was influential for a number of years, and the clin d'oeil towards history was present. But I think he escaped the great dangers of postmodernism more actually than the first director of the Venice Biennial, and that is Paolo Portoghesi. Although Paolo Portoghesi initially had a valid form of postmodernism, but later sometimes he was a little bit himself too affected by well, it was the end of the millennium, the end of the century. There was a lot of I would say nostalgia, the passage of time. Maybe architects felt that they couldn't jump in the third millennium without a serious rooting in the past, in history. But the best of them avoided the trappings of historicism. And I wouldn't say that Aldo Rossi was a historicist architect. No, he was not. Now, Palace Hotel in Fukuoka in Japan. He built two buildings in Japan, as far as I know. We are going to see both, 1986, 1989. That was when postmodernism was ravishing the world. Well, it started a little bit earlier, like in 1981, 1982. This is the building in Japan by Aldo Rossi. Now, you would say, why would Japan need Aldo Rossi when they had and have very important architects themselves? But the Netherlands does the same thing. You know, they have their own great architects, and still they invite other important architects to build in the Netherlands. So these countries are open. You know, they don't need necessarily Aldo Rossi. But I mean, we are going to see later also a project built by Aldo Rossi in the Netherlands. So, you know, being open towards the innovations, the culture, the architectural culture of other countries, of other architects is a good thing. Maybe this practice should be allowed in other countries as well, not just Japan and the Netherlands. And of course, there are others, but there are some countries which do not have the wisdom that Japan and the Netherlands have. Patriotism is dangerous in culture. Because it could become pompous and restrictive, and it leads to marginality and this is the rendering. Where are the windows? And this is the building. The windows are on the sides, but the front elevation seems to be windowless. Very interesting. I mean, the spaces for the windows are there, but it seems the windows are blocked. I wonder why he did that. It's like a mask. Aldo Rossi was a very cultured man. He probably made some references to the Japanese culture, and this was his way of expressing that knowledge that he had. I worked for a Japanese architect in New York, and he told me, well, he was not an architect. He came to the United States as a hippie, and he opened his interior design firm, and he was very successful. And he told me most men in Japan have ulcer because they don't express their emotions. They smile all the time. It's in the culture of the country not to let your anger or whatever, come out. And and the effect is you get sick. Although I don't know if he was correct, because it's known the longevity, the lifespan in Japan is very high. But if you look at this building, and you could say it's not expressing its emotions towards the towards the outside. It does on the sides, but not in the main elevation, which is very unusual. In that sense, you could say it's a Japanese building, but built by an Italian architect. A lighthouse theater in Toronto. Yes, sometimes his architecture, looks a little bit, like toys architecture. It does have that element. Like here, you are not sure, is it an actual architectonic construction or is it a model? Now, when you look at this building, you wouldn't imagine it's in Toronto, which has a cold climate. It looks more like a Mediterranean architecture than, an architecture for Canada. A monument in Milan, 1988-1990, and we already saw a work. And you remember probably when I commented on that picture with those children on the steps, because there are steps here too, but also on another installation. I don't know how to call it, a fountain that was done early in his career. And we are going to see, this is the back of the. Is it a monument to Sandro Pertini? I don't know who Sandro Pertini was. Built 1988, 1990. And here we see the steps with the people sitting on these steps less rigidly than, those poor children aligned as they were in that school. So it's just this structure that Aldo Rossi built, not the building behind or nearby. Milan. And this is the other side with the two lovers happily in love. With a fountain, triangular fountain by water exit by Aldo Rossi behind. It's a cube, actually. It's a cube which on the other side has the steps. If you go to Milan, you can probably come across it, even if you don't search for it at one point, maybe. Now, I mentioned that the Netherlands also built a work by Aldo Rossi, and this is it, 1989, apartment buildings in Hague. It's huge. This man had the chance to build very large housing complexes, and this is in the Netherlands. He built another work in the Netherlands, and I hope we are going to see it a little bit later. Rather monumental, this one. No green, as you can see, at that time there was no concern with the green facade, although he used the color green, but no vegetation, not even balconies. Residential building and former industrial area, Città di Castello, 1990-1992. He loved this architectural mask, as you can see, with the fountain, the triangular one. It was not be like this, or it was changed. But we cannot really say that this is an architecture of openness. It's actually very rigid towards the street and opaque, and no wonder those graffitis there. Protesting actually the building. It's like a mausoleum. It's like Let's read again. It's a residential building and former industrial area. I don't know what that means, but it's a residential building. But when you look at this, you would say that it could have been something else, serving death, not life, not apartment buildings. In the back, yes, there are the windows, but towards the street is really so imposing, imposingly showing an opaqueness which you would associate with a mausoleum, not with a residential, with apartment buildings, with apartments. A clubhouse, 1990, 1993, we're approaching the end of the presentation. Here, as you can see, he would have infuriated Bruno Sevi for sure, because many of the things he does are perfectly symmetrical. I'm not very fond of this project. An administrative building for the Walt Disney Company in Orlando, Florida, 1991. Walt Disney wanted to have Aldo Rossi as well, and here it is. And I actually, with all due respect for Aldo Rossi, I am rather disappointed of this monumentalization and infantilism. I probably the cartoons, the early cartoons of Walt Disney had some innocence in them, but then it became an industrial empire. And here you have Aldo Rossi, an accomplice of I mean, this is an administrative building for the Walt Disney Company, but I don't think it's innocent. I don't think it's, no, and he does repeat himself. I'm tired of that triangle. Contemporary art center in the island of Vassivière in Beaumont-du-Lac, France. The rendering, the painting, the drawing, name it as you want. And again, the lighthouse. No, maybe I'm getting tired of this presentation, but you see, too much success is not good. And, he's beginning to repeat himself, and a post office and apartments near the City of Music in Paris, 1991. Now, he tried to accommodate to his architecture, influences from the, the roofs of so many buildings in Paris, mansard. Yeah, it shows some contextualism. It's true, but from here downwards, it's Aldo Rossi through and through. Funnily, I was very, very close to this building, but I never saw it. Nor did I know at that time that Aldo Rossi built actually in Paris. I don't know what to think of this. I'm not highly seduced by this. I would rather appreciate this, although I love color. But what's going on here is a little bit schematic, and with the choice of color is maybe I become a moralist. Forgive me. Now, this other work in the Netherlands, which I mentioned, is from 1995, and unfortunately, we are approaching the time of his death. This is the work in the Netherlands. I don't know exactly what is the function of this. It's a museum and some kind of an observatory at the top, I think. And this is the model of the building. An interesting gate here, though. rather cryptical. Perfectly symmetrical, of course. So in that sense, he was a modern architect, but he employed stylistic elements which were, at least in the vision of someone like Bruno Sevi, not modern. A museum in the Netherlands, Aldo Rossi. We see again the octagon, but it's enclosed, is within a cylinder. And here is what happens at the top of that cylinder. I don't think he did this ornamental work on the ceiling, on the dome, no. But the architecture is his. Nor do I know the meaning of this or the symbolism of this. Maybe there was. I mean, to create a psychedelic space like this or room within a museum must have some kind of, you know, reason to be, perhaps. I don't know. The Netherlands, Aldo Rossi. And sometimes his buildings look amazingly like his drawings. Like you look at this picture, you would say this could be a rendering, or it's a model, or the distance between drawing, model, and the actual building is not very long sometimes. Interesting staircase here. At that time, I guess there was no preoccupation for the access in public buildings like museums of people with a handicap. Something like this would not be acceptable today. But at that time, I guess it was possible. Another hotel in Japan, I mentioned, he built twice in Japan, 1996, 1998. It's the reddish structure. I don't know if he did the other one in front of it. Maybe he did both. That is not a very impressive building, in my opinion. Another shopping center in Sardinia, 1997, with a monumental interest. I shop, therefore I am. Some mysterious, pair of white columns. Here again, we see the pair, behind it, something else happens, but plenty of columns, those very columns that Paul Prix hates. Scholastic Corporation headquarters. We are very close to the end. We have a few more minutes. This was built, I think it was finalized after he died. It's in downtown Manhattan. Is this building with white columns? This is his, Aldo Rossi. So it's just this building is by him, and there are all kinds of commentaries about the way he inspired himself from the architectonic elements of this building, of this facade. Yeah, to an extent maybe, but it shouldn't be exaggerated. The contextualization of the building is perhaps real to an extent, but not a very large extent, I would say. I mean, after all, you look at this building and you look at this one, and they are very different. This is a very fine building, existing building. This is what Aldo Rossi did. This one has nothing in common with this building, and a little bit, maybe a little bit with this, but just a little bit. Here is a different sensitivity, a different feeling. Here with the large pieces of glass. This is more embroidered, at least at the lower levels. Now you see here in this analysis, someone found, resemblances between the Aldo Rossi's building and the Little Singer building, or Singer building, as it is called in Manhattan. Construction technique used kit of parts, deeply recessed curtain walls. Well, they are more recessed in the building on the right than on the building on the left. Same colors used. Well, yes and no. Anyway. I mean, where are the white columns in the building on the right? Those are Aldo Rossi's invention. That's it. So let's wish him happy birthday, and I will talk again about him on the day when he died. If I remember correctly, I think sometimes in September.